Okay, so what we talked about last time was a little bit about Federalist 10 and the difference between republics and democracies. And we talked about how a republic is a representative government where people do vote. It does have democratic features in some ways, as in people vote for elected officials to represent them. And those elected officials are supposed to craft law and craft policy that they are accountable to the people for in being voted in and out of office. And that this policy is supposed to be kind of for the general will of the people, right? But there's, as we said, there's some problems with that, because will of the people, they're individuals with wills, not a single blob with a will. So anyway, they're trying to do that. Then the politicians, the elites who make the laws, are all themselves under the laws, and there is rule of law. Okay, this even comes down to like a constitutional republic. A constitutional republic states limitations for the government, and it states guarantees for people's rights. So for example, you have a guarantee towards your rights. You cannot be beaten up, enslaved, have someone else commit a crime against you, including the government, and that there is that accountability. Now, that's what a republic is supposed to be, and they do fall short in practice. But many people came to understand that in terms of a free government with a free people, republics were kind of seen to be the best in the estimation of some. And so Montesquieu, it's a French writer, argued that republics were the best, but that republics could only exist over a small territory with a small population, because that's the only way you can really have true political representation, and other reasons. And then Madison, James Madison, a few years later, tries to flip this situation around and say, no. Large republics are actually preferable, and here's why he believes that. So we've talked about these different things here: democracy, majority rule, popular will, those types of concepts. But we also talked about that democracy and majority rule can be dangerous, because a pure democracy has no guarantee of the protection of the rights of the people. And someone wrote a few years ago in an answer on a card or one of the exams that we were doing, somebody wrote in answer to the question, how will rights and liberties be protected in a democracy? How can we guarantee that as being the case? And they said, well, the majority will always vote for the rights and liberties of other people, that the majority will vote to protect the rights of other people. And I said, sometimes, but more often than not, majorities don't always vote in the interest of the protection of the rights and liberties of others. So it can be very dangerous to have a majority be the voting and determinative power in government, except insofar as it can be limited. And that's what republics try to do, is they try to limit it where you can't vote away someone's rights. Okay, so the United States is supposed to be a republic, and the 50 individual states are all supposed to be republics. In fact, the Constitution says that the U.S. government must guarantee that all the states maintain a republican form of government, meaning any state that participates in the U.S. Federal Union must be a republic in order to participate. If they want to be something else, that's fine, in theory, but they cannot be part of the United States if they had a different government than a republic. So the United States is actually supposed to be a republic of republics, But one of the things that we talked about yesterday a little bit, or I introduced yesterday, was the question, is America too big for that? Is America too large to really be a republic? I mean, really, is California too big for that? California has millions of people, right? So you could really debate at what level a government of a republic can really be effective. Can people really be represented in the United States with 327 million of us, with all kinds of different views and disagreements? Can we really be represented locally by 435 representatives? And that puts the situation as 435 representatives really end up, well, one representative ends up representing, if we averaged it out, for about 750,000 people. Now, how do you represent 750,000 people? How do you make decisions for 750,000 people who don't all agree with each other? And whatever decision you're going to make is unpopular with somebody, at least. And James Madison, he didn't understand that because he didn't know the future, not because he wasn't smart, but he didn't understand that America would grow to the size that it is today. And his original idea was one for every 30,000 people, one representative for every 30,000 people. Okay, so the America then looked a lot different than America now, where we still have 435 people representing 327 million people. Back then, it was supposed to be one to every 30,000 people. So the states were a lot smaller, and the regions were a lot smaller, where the states would have different amounts of representatives coming from these districts. But you even think about and I've mentioned this before, you even think about the difficulty of one person representing 30,000 people. Now, 30,000 people who live together in an area, town, a city, 30,000 people that live in the same region, maybe share a culture, maybe share religion, maybe share, other certain values or something like that. Okay, maybe those people would have similar ways of thinking to where they could have representatives represent them and be effective in a republic. But you even think about what it means if those 30,000 people disagree with each other. You can even think about my 1-for-2 formulation. Let's say that there's one representative that has to represent just two people. One person thinks one way, one person thinks another way. They both fundamentally disagree, and that one person has to represent them both. Well, there's some pretty serious challenges with that. And with political, just even the concept of political representation, we need to ask, is that even really possible? But we're talking about republics, okay? So the fundamental presupposition or assumption of both Madison and Montesquieu was that republics are preferable, okay? Now, we've talked about this before, but you've got majority rules. So say it's 100 people. And I don't know why it works out like this. I created this slide a long time ago, and there's like those missing 2 on the end, but it really is 100. I've gone through and counted them. And so simple majority is 51 votes, okay? So we think of it as being, voting as being kind of simple, that, all right, these people conform to the results. They're outnumbered. They say, okay, well, that's fine. We'll choose this restaurant over that restaurant or something. But there's some issues with that, because what if this 51 decides to vote for something that harms this voting minority? And sometimes it's, it can be that issue. So James Madison, he writes Federalist 10, about the issue of factions, and he abandons centuries of political theory. Says, no, everything that came before me, that what had built up to this point, I reject that to say that larger republics are preferable. Now, what he fears are called factions. Factions is kind of an older term. It's still used somewhat today, but not as commonly. And what they really are interest groups, okay, within small republics. And so his concern, okay, let's say there's this small republic. Let's say it only has 100,000 people, okay? Now, most of these people in the small republic, maybe they share some common identities, and maybe race, religion, ethnicity, values, family heritage, common interests. It doesn't matter, okay? But they share some things. But let's say that of that 100,000, there are 50 people who are in the minority, okay? They don't share the same religion, same race, same cultural values, and things of that nature. Now, Madison points out something that's true, that those 50 people out of 100,000 could become very vulnerable because these different interest groups and factions may use the government in order to harm those with whom they disagree. And a faction of 90,000, 99,950, or a faction of, 1,000, or a faction of 20,000, people who think the same way. These are different sizes of interest groups that they may influence the local government with less numbers. They may influence the local government in order to harm the rights of those with whom they disagree, who are in the minority. Okay, the minority doesn't have to mean like a racial minority, although it could. It just means a minority group in some way, that you're not the majority population. Okay, so Madison says, look, the problem is in these small republics is you have these interest groups that gather, and then they go to the government, and then they they influence the government on their behalf to write laws and policies to be enforced on those who they disagree with, and they can do so without having large numbers. So he says that's the problem with small republics, is you end up having just a few people can take over the system without, not take over like a hostile government takeover, but a few people can manipulate and influence the system on a very small scale, right? Let me give a few examples. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these examples, but let me just point out some things here, okay? So Utah has a lot of Mormons, all right? Utah has a lot of Mormons. And it's fair to think that the government, local and maybe state, are influenced by those people who share kind of a common culture, or definitely share a religion for the most part, and share certain values and things like that. And that may influence the government of the local cities and the state of Utah. And that's fine for most people. That's kind of the way that most people want it. But there are people in Utah who maybe aren't Mormons, okay? So Madison's argument is that they're in a spot of vulnerability, that most people in the United States are not Mormons, but because there's a heavy concentration of Mormons in Utah, the Utah state and local governments may be influenced by that, and others would be vulnerable. Or Palmdale, okay? As you guys know, and I'm not saying there's anything right or wrong with this, but as you guys know, Palmdale has a lot of Hispanics, large Hispanic population. Okay, so there's nothing inherently, it's just neutral. That's just the way it is. That being said, that's, it could be a faction. It's in Palmdale, it's like that, but in other places, it's not. And so Madison's idea is that different groups may form within small republics, and they don't need huge numbers to influence the government. So his idea is to let's have one big republic. Okay, so let me use the Mormon example again. All right, Mormons in Utah, okay, that's a pretty big majority, but Mormons in the overall United States, well, most people in the United States aren't Mormon, so it kind of waters down the voting power and the government influence of the Mormons. Overall, like in the United States, they're not a huge interest group on the size of the United States, but in the state of Utah, they are a huge interest group. So Madison's idea is, let's have a large republic where these different local factions will not have as much power. Okay, so goes on, he explains his reasoning about factions. He said there's two methods of dealing with factions. He says to prevent its causes or controlling its effects. And so the example he gives here, he says liberty, human individual freedom, is to faction what air is to fire. And he says, okay, the reason factions exist is because people are free. He says, look, you could get rid of factions in two ways. Number one, you could give everybody the same opinions. From here on out, let's all agree to think the same way. And even there, people would say, well, I don't agree with that. And so he said, look, if we could somehow wave a magic wand and give everybody the same opinions, then I guess there wouldn't be differing interest groups, but he recognizes that that's impossible. He also says that, well, you could get rid of factions by removing liberty, where people are not allowed to join groups, people are not allowed to speak, people are not allowed to think differently, people are not allowed to express their thoughts, people are not allowed to question authority, people are not allowed to do anything against the status quo, and therefore they may not form opposing groups or hang out with people who think like them. But he says that by getting rid of liberty to get rid of factions or interest groups, he said the cure would be worse than the disease. That would be worse. So he says that would be like saying we should get rid of air so that we don't have as many fires, right? The cure, getting rid of air, getting rid of fires by getting rid of air would be worse than the disease, because without air, we're all going to die. So the risk that fires might exist because we have oxygen, that the idea of Madison is saying is oxygen is so valuable and necessary that it's worth the risk of fires. And then he believes the same thing about liberty. He says, okay, well, freedom of association, people's freedom to speak and form groups and form interest groups and try to get their way in the government is a necessary part of human existence, of what it means to be free. So what he reasons is, just as the consequences of removing air, which is the cause, would be worse than the damage from fire, which is the effect, so abandoning liberty to end factions would be worse than the problems of factions. So how does he think that should be solved? Well, by having a large republic. Let me give you an example with kind of a graphic here. Okay, so Madison's views, and these colors just represent different interest groups, right? It's kind of ironic though, because I'm actually colorblind. I can see that these are different colors, but some of them are actually a little bit harder to see for me. But anyway, these are small republics, okay? So these are, let's say these are border lines. These republics have nothing to do with each other, all right? They have their own laws, they have their own governments, they're not in a confederacy, nothing like that, all right? So there's not, the government that rules is this government, this government, this government, this government. There's not one government ruling them, okay? Now, you can see if you kind of count up based on the colors what the different interests are. Like blue is kind of dominant here, right? Black is kind of dominant here, right? Green is here, okay? So here, let's say that in this upper left-hand situation, this republic, blue is going to form a faction and influence the government. And they can influence the government against red and green and black and orange, all these things, okay? So they can influence the government. Now, they're not a huge amount of people, but they are a large voting and influential interest group in this small republic, okay? Same with these other situations. Now, Madison's idea, and it is kind of interesting, although I think it has one major flaw in it, at least, that he did not foresee, okay? His idea is let's have one large republic. These republics will still continue to exist, but instead, with the Constitution, they are brought together in a federal union, and instead of like blue being influential over everything, well, now blue is a lot more watered down. Okay. Now, maybe you've noticed already the issue. If you haven't, that's okay, because it took me some years to think through and recognize that this was the case. And the problem I will identify like this. Same problem, only bigger. Same problem, only bigger. Now, and to be fair, in Madison's time, number one, the Federalist 10 was written before the Constitution was implemented, so he couldn't foresee that. Number two, he didn't recognize, the idea of like modern communication and things and technology would make possible. But I do think he should have been smart enough, because he was a genius person, I do think he should have been smart enough to recognize that the problem with a small republic having interest groups that would influence the government would also come into a large republic, which now these people can still share their interest groups, but they can do so on a larger scale to influence not only their own local government, but the government of the United States. Now, it may not be the same interest groups, okay? So like I said with the Mormons, and if you're Mormon, I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying that that's just an effective example, I think. So yeah, the Mormons may not be hugely influential with the U.S. federal government, maybe somewhat as that type of interest group, but it may be something else, right? It may be unions, maybe big businesses, maybe corporations, maybe this or that. Now, that being said, there's a lot of saying, okay, well, we really need to have some government action to control these interest groups. On the other hand, something that I'd have you think about is if the interest groups are using government to do things or grant themselves privileges that they wouldn't otherwise have, which is what everybody wants to do with that type of power, then we should focus also on, if not exclusively on, the entity that is able to grant that unique power, which is government. And so Madison believes that this will solve the issue of small republics versus large republics. Montesquieu had written before him in this book called The Spirit of the Laws that was really influential over the American political philosophy because it talked about things like separation of powers, different governments. He does kind of political history, talks about different governments and evaluates them through history and says, okay, here's the features of what works best in his opinion of a government. And he argues for small republics and argued that Republican government cannot work on a large scale. Okay, he says it is natural for a republic to have only a small territory, otherwise it cannot long subsist, meaning it won't last long if it has a large territory or keeps expanding. That's what happens to empires as they keep expanding, and then eventually they disintegrate. They go into decline or they collapse, and then it falls into several smaller kingdoms or governments within that. And it's kind of true that the larger in population an entity gets, the less effective often it is. You have more power to do things with more people. However, you start to get a lot less agreement, a lot less social cohesion, where you have people agreeing and sharing values and thinking the same way, and you have a lot less sense of representation because people feel like that the government is just an irresponsive oligarchy that does not represent their views and in fact represents them negatively. And there's actually some research on this in the more modern times and some political science research called the median voter theorem. The median voter theorem. And what the median voter theorem is there are people that are on two sides of an issue of, okay, I think this side thinks the opposite. They both have their points. They both vote. And then what happens either in representation or through their vote is that it kind of ends up in the middle, and you end up with a diluting of both sides, an undermining of both sides, and both sides are unhappy with the result. So you have some problems with that, and the larger a government or a republic grows, governments too, but specifically republics grow, the less they can effectively represent the people, is Montesquieu's argument. And he has some good points for that as well, because you could think of the difficulties of actually representing people and whether or not that can really be done with millions of people. So think about the US House of Representatives. There are 435 people for 327 million Americans. Now, if we said, okay, well, let's just add more representation to make it appropriate. Let's say it's like one representative for every 30,000 people in the states. We'll redraw districts and all these type of things and make that happen. That being said, and there are some problems with that too, because the district drawing has a lot of issues with it. But that being said, that would cause the Republic of the United States to be have 10,000 representatives. And I want you to think about having a meeting with 435 people coming to agreement for millions. And now think about having a meeting with 1,000 people coming to an agreement for millions of people on all kinds of different issues that people disagree on. Now think about having a football stadium with 10,000 people in it, and just the logistics of 10,000 people all talking, voting, trying to make decisions. And what if one person, 1 minute was given to each person to talk about what they think the most important issue is, right? This becomes ineffective to the point where we may even wonder, like, is that even possible for the United States to have a government, or any government, to have a republic that's that size? Okay, so we do have some serious challenges with that. And James Madison didn't know the United States would be this size. Okay, Montesquieu, last thing here, says that in an extensive or a large republic, the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 private views. It is subordinate to exceptions. It depends on accidents. In a small one, the interest of the public is more obvious, better understood, and more within reach of every citizen. Abuses have less extent and, of course, are less protected. So what he's saying is, in a large republic, it's very hard to come down to what the public good is. Now, we've talked about the issues of saying the common good, the public good, the will of the people, the will of the majority, those type of things, and the issues with that. But even skipping over all that he's saying that the general good that people might agree on within a smaller size group, a small republic, the bigger you grow, the less people have a voice. And therefore, the people who are maybe wealthier, more politically connected, or can form interest groups or have more time in order to do that, they're going to be the ones who influence the government. Right? That's why he says that smaller republics work better. And so he says that, that it's sacrificed to 1,000 private views, meaning you've got all kinds of, the more voices you add into the discussion, the less obvious it is what the public good is. So he says in a smaller one, he says the public good is more obvious, better understood, and within reach of every citizen. He says then, now what if the government in a republic, as governments tend to do, republics are no exception, what if they act corruptly? What if they abuse power? Okay, well, even in that situation, abuses have less extent, meaning they don't go as far, and of course are less protected, meaning they are more accountable. The abuses don't have the size and scope, and there's competition and threat from the idea that people can more easily leave a smaller republic than a larger republic. Okay, so for example, it's easier to move out of California, as many people are doing, than to leave the United States. Right? So this is why Madison and Montesquieu made their arguments for small versus large republics. Montesquieu arguing for the smaller republics, Madison arguing for the larger republics. You have to decide which of their views makes the most sense to you, which one works the best, which one works not only in theory, but in actual practice.